Story 1.
I've never been one to believe in supernatural things or strange coincidences. I've always had my feet on the ground and a rational explanation for everything. I live in a quiet suburb of Boston, Massachusetts, have worked as a financial analyst for 5 years, and live a very ordinary life. My name is Nathan Cooper. I'm 28 years old, and until that day in September 2023, my biggest concern was deciding which series to watch after work or which restaurant to order delivery on the weekend. I lived alone in a small but comfortable apartment on Beacon Street. I had a well-established routine and, honestly, I had never experienced anything that was out of the ordinary. He was the kind of guy others would consider boringly predictable, always on schedule, always on autopilot. It was on a Tuesday night that it all started. I had just gotten home after a particularly exhausting day at the office. It was around 7:40 p.m. I had ordered a pizza from Tony's, my favorite pizza place since moving here, and was sprawled out on the couch watching some random YouTube videos when my cell phone rang. Normally, I don't answer unknown numbers, but I was waiting for a call from the bank about a new card, so I decided to answer. The number had the area code 617, which is from here in Boston, which made it easier for me to answer. When I swiped the screen to accept the call, I couldn't have imagined that that moment would completely change my perception of everything I believed to be real or possible. As soon as I answered, I was greeted by absolute silence. It wasn't the normal silence of a bad call or even a prank call, where you usually hear some background noise or breathing. It was a complete vacuum, as if sound had been sucked out of the world. I spent about 15 seconds say, "Hello? Hello?" until I thought about turning it off. When it happened, a whispered, almost metallic voice pronounced my name. Nathan. I felt a shiver run up my spine. It wasn't just from the tone of the voice, but from the way my name was said, as if the person on the other end of the line was savoring every syllable. Before I could respond, the voice continued, "I know what you did that night." The whisper was so close that it felt like the person was speaking directly into my ear, inside my apartment. With my hands shaking, I hung up the call immediately. My heart was racing and I could feel cold sweat running down my forehead. What night? What the hell was that person talking about? I spent the next few minutes racking my memory, trying to remember anything I could have done wrong, any dark secret, but nothing came to mind. I decided to call back. After all, if it was some kind of joke, I wanted to get it out in the open. When I dialed the number, an automated message informed me that it did not exist. I tried a few more times, but I always got the same message. I opened the call log to confirm I hadn't written it down wrong, but the number simply wasn't there anymore. It was as if that call had never happened. The pizza arrived about 20 minutes later, but I could barely eat it. I stared at my cell phone, waiting for it to ring again, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for all of this. My mind started to wander to dark places. Could it be a stalker? Someone from work trying to scare me? Or worse, was there something I had actually done and blocked from my memory? I turned on the TV at a higher volume than normal, just to fill the silence that now felt suffocating. I spent the next few hours obsessively checking the window locks and the door, something I had never done before. Boston has always been a safe city for me, at least in this region, but that night every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Around 11 p.m., when I had finally managed to calm down a bit, deciding that it was probably just some idiot trying to scare me, I received a text message. It was a different number, but also with the Boston area code. My blood ran cold when I opened it. It was a photo of me, clearly taken that same day, leaving the building where I work on Congress Street. I was wearing my favorite navy coat from Gap and carrying my Dell laptop bag that my sister Emma gave me last Christmas. The photo had been taken from a distance, probably across the street, but it was sharp enough to clearly identify me. The message accompanying the photo simply said, "You shouldn't have done that, Nathan. Now we need to talk about the consequences." At that moment, I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I ran to the window and closed all the curtains, obsessively checking to see if anyone was watching me on the street. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for a Tuesday, except for an Uber car parked a few houses away. I tried to respond to the message, my hands shaking so much that I made a typo several times. "Who are you? What are you talking about?" The message was sent, but the 2 ticks never turned blue. I tried calling this number too, but it went straight to voicemail. A female robotic voice said that the number was not available. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I received a strange call and a photo of myself? They would probably laugh and say it was nothing. I forced myself to sit down and breathe deeply, trying to organize my thoughts. I took out my notebook and started making a list of all the people who might have a reason to scare me. Sarah, my ex-girlfriend? But we broke up over a year ago amicably, and as far as I know, she was living in Seattle now. Mark from the accounting department, who lost a promotion to me in July. Kind of extreme, he didn't seem like the type. While I was making the list, I received another message. This time it was a photo of the inside of Tony's Pizza. I was there last week with my coworkers celebrating the closing of a project. In the photo, I was laughing at something Kevin had said, completely oblivious to whoever was photographing me. The caption read, "You laugh now, but you won't laugh when you know what's coming." Panic started to take over me. It was no longer a matter of coincidence or a joke. Someone had been stalking me for days, maybe weeks, and I hadn't even realized it. I remembered strange little things that I had noticed in the last few weeks but ignored. Noises in the building hallway when I got home, the feeling of being watched on the subway, a black car that seemed to be parked near my building more often than usual. My mind started connecting dots that might not even exist. On impulse, I picked up my cell phone and called Emma, my sister. Even though it was almost midnight, she answered on the 3rd ring. His sleepy voice on the other end brought me a brief moment of comfort. "Nate, did something happen?" I told her everything, my voice shaking occasionally as I described the night's events. Emma, always the more rational of the two of us, tried to calm me down. He suggested that I take screenshots of everything and file an online police report, just in case. She also insisted that I spend the night at her apartment in Cambridge. She lived with her husband Mike in a gated community with 24-hour security. As I considered the offer, I heard a noise coming from the hallway of my apartment. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I was completely silent, and Emma realized, Nate, are you still there?" The noise stopped for a moment, and then I heard it distinctly. 3 firm knocks on my door. "Emma," I whispered into the phone, "there's someone at my door." I had barely finished the sentence when my cell phone turned off completely. It didn't turn off normally. The screen simply went black, as if the battery had been ripped out. I found myself frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the door. The knocks came again, this time at a different pace, slower, more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. The silence between each beat was deafening. My apartment was on the 4th floor, and I knew everyone else on the floor. Mrs. Martinez from 401, the MIT student couple from 402, and Mr. Johnson from 404, who was traveling for work. None of them would knock on my door at that hour. I tried to turn on my cell phone several times, but it wouldn't respond. My notebook had also turned off by itself, and when I tried to plug any of the devices into the socket, nothing happened. It was as if all the electronics around me had died simultaneously. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I silently approached the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely dark, which was strange, because the emergency lights were supposed to be working even if the power had gone out. But I could make out a silhouette. There was definitely someone standing there, a tall, motionless figure. I couldn't see details of her face or clothes, but something about her posture seemed off. It was as if the person was tilted at an impossible angle, as if they were contorting themselves in a way that no human body should be capable of. And then, as if sensing I was watching, the figure turned its head directly toward the peephole. That's when it hit me. Where there should have been a face, There was only darkness deeper than the hallway itself. I backed away from the door so quickly that I tripped and fell to the floor. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. For a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, I stood there frozen, waiting for the doorknob to turn or for the door to be kicked down. But nothing happened. The silence was absolute. Not even the noise of the traffic outside could be heard. After what felt like an hour but was probably just a few minutes, I summoned the courage to stand up. My legs were shaking so much that they were barely supporting me. With hesitant steps, I approached the door again. I took a deep breath and looked through the peephole once more. The hallway was lit normally and completely empty. Instantly, all my devices came back to life simultaneously, as if they had never stopped working. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the corner of the room with a kitchen knife in my hand, watching the door. When the sun rose, I left the apartment and went straight to the police station. I made a detailed police report, showed the photos and call numbers. The officer who responded to me, Officer Rodriguez, seemed genuinely concerned and said they would investigate. A week passed and nothing else happened. No calls, no messages, no strange figures in the hallway. The officer called me saying that the numbers were all disposable prepaid cell phones, impossible to trace. I ended up moving to a new apartment on the other side of town and installed security cameras in every room. To this day, I don't know what happened that night or who or what was chasing me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still get the feeling that I'm being watched. And whenever I get a call from an unknown number, I let it go to voicemail. Some things are better not to know. You know that kind of storm that makes you feel tiny? It was on a night like this in March 2019 that I had the most terrifying experience of my life. I had just moved into an old house in Massachusetts, one of those two-story colonial houses that seem to have a story to tell. I was living alone for the first time, enjoying my moment of independence after getting a remote job as a software developer. The house was on the outskirts of Salem, in a more isolated area, one of those properties that have a certain amount of space between neighbors. The property had that typical historic New England feel, with solid oak staircases, long hallways, and a basement that I had never dared to explore properly. That particular night, I was finishing up an important project in my room upstairs when the storm started to get stronger. Lightning lit up the entire room through the old sash windows, and the wind howled in a way that made it seem like the entire house was groaning. Around 11 p.m., I decided to go down to get some water and maybe a snack to get me through the early hours of work. The kitchen was on the ground floor on the other side of the house, and I had walked this route hundreds of times. I didn't bother to turn on all the lights. I just used my cell phone's flashlight to light the way. The wooden floor creaked beneath my bare feet, but I was used to it. I grabbed my water, a Nature Valley, and started to go back to the room. That's when a particularly strong flash of lightning lit up the entire house for a few seconds, and my blood instantly ran cold. There, standing in the middle of the stairs, was a shadow. It wasn't just any shadow, projected by some piece of furniture or object. It was clearly the silhouette of a tall, thin person, completely still. The most disturbing thing is that even when the light from the lightning was gone, I could still make out that dark shape perfectly, as if it was emitting its own darkness. My first instinct was to try to rationalize. After all, it was almost midnight and I was alone in that huge house. My mind must have been playing tricks on me, right? But the more I looked, the more real that figure seemed. The silhouette had a strange quality, as if it sucked in all the light around it. And the scariest thing, she was positioned in a way that seemed to be watching me, with her head slightly tilted to my side. My hands started to shake so much that I almost dropped the glass of water. The noise of the storm outside seemed to have diminished, as if even nature had paused to witness that moment. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably just a few seconds, trying to decide whether to run back to the kitchen or try to run past that thing to get to my room. Then something happened that made my heart almost stop. The shadow started to move. It wasn't a normal movement like someone going up or down the stairs. It was more like a ripple as if the figure was floating a few inches above the steps. And as she moved, I could have sworn I heard a very low, almost imperceptible sound somewhere between a hum and a whisper, at a frequency that made my teeth hurt. The temperature around me suddenly plummeted, to the point where I could see my own breath in the air. I dropped the glass of water and Nature Valley right there, my whole body shaking as I desperately tried to think of what to do. In that moment of absolute panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I pointed my cell phone's flashlight directly at that thing. That's when I wished I hadn't done it. In the direct light, the figure seemed to change. It was as if her darkness had texture now, something between smoke and fabric, and I could make out details I would rather not have seen. Where there should have been a face, there was only a void deeper than the rest of the silhouette, except for two spots that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. Like eyes, but not quite eyes. The thing reacted to the light in a way that made me question everything I knew about physics. Instead of dispelling the shadow, the light seemed to make it more solid, more present, more real. And then, in a movement that defied all logic, the figure began to lean towards me, still keeping its feet, if it even had feet, fixed on the same step. Panic completely took over when I realized that this tilt was unnatural. The shadow's body was bending at an impossible angle, as if it had no bones or physical structure. My instincts finally screamed louder than the fear that paralyzed me, and I turned to run towards the kitchen. That's when I heard that, a sound that still haunts me in nightmares. Something between a deep breath and the sound of old pages of a book being quickly flipped. The sound was coming from behind me, and it seemed to be getting closer. I ran like crazy, knocking over an antique table in the hallway in the process, my heart beating so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. I managed to get to the kitchen and slammed the door, locking it immediately. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely pick up my cell phone to try to call someone. But of course, at that time, there was no signal at all. The storm seemed to have intensified outside, and the lightning was now even more frequent. Through the kitchen window, I could see the branches of the backyard trees twisting violently against the dark sky. I leaned against the kitchen island, trying to catch my breath and think of a plan. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The temperature was dropping again, and that buzzing whisper started to return, but now it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. The kitchen lights began to flicker, not because of the storm, but in an irregular pattern that seemed almost intentional. I looked around for something I could use as a weapon, even though I knew it would be useless against whatever that was. The modern kitchen, which had once seemed so welcoming with its white cabinets and stainless appliances, now seemed like a nightmare scenario with the lights flickering. The worst thing was the growing feeling that I was no longer alone there. Even with the door locked, I could feel a presence gathering in the room. The shadows in the corners of the kitchen seemed to be moving, reaching toward me like thin black fingers. The air became so thick that breathing became difficult, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. And then, in the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator, I saw something that made me let out a muffled scream. The silhouette was right behind me. My whole body froze when I realized that thing had walked through the door as if it didn't even exist. In the reflection of the refrigerator, I saw the figure move even closer. It must have been less than a meter away from me now. The cold was so intense that my teeth were chattering, and that humming whisper had turned into something that sounded almost like words, but in a language that my brain refused to process. It was at that moment that something even more bizarre happened. All the magnets on the refrigerator began to fall, one by one, as if they were being pulled by an invisible force. And they didn't just fall, they slid across the floor towards the thing, as if it had its own magnetic field. The lights were now flashing so fast they created a strobe effect, and with each flash I could see the shadow a little closer, its shape increasingly distorted. In pure desperation, I threw myself toward the back door on the other side of the kitchen. As I ran, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. It wasn't a physical touch. It was more like someone had rubbed dry ice very close to my skin. The contact, however brief, sent a wave of terror so deep through my body that my legs nearly gave out. I managed to open the door and ran out onto the back porch, the heavy rain instantly drenching me. The temperature outside must have been around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but it felt warm compared to the unearthly cold emanating from that thing. I tripped over the porch steps and fell into the wet backyard grass, mud staining my Boston Red Sox pajamas. When I turned to look at the house, I saw something I will never forget. All the windows on the first floor were completely dark, except for those 2 points of absolute emptiness that I had seen before, the eyes of shadow watching me from each one of the windows simultaneously. I lay there on the grass, the rain punishing my body, unable to look away from the impossible sight. How could that thing be in all the windows at the same time? And then, in a flash of lucidity amidst the terror, I noticed something crucial. The basement. The only window in the basement, small and low to the floor, was emanating a dim, greenish light, something I had never seen before. It was different from the other lights in the house. It had an antique quality, like those tungsten bulbs from the early 20th century. And the strangest thing, this light seemed to be pulsing, in the same rhythm as that buzzing whisper that still echoed in my ears, even out there. At that moment, something inside me said that that light had something to do with what was happening, that perhaps it was the origin of it all. In my head, I started to put the pieces together. The house was old, from 1892 to be exact. The realtor had made a point of mentioning this as if it were a positive point. He had also said something about the first owner being an eccentric scientist who conducted experiments in the basement, but I had dismissed that as talk to sell the property. Now, drenched and shivering with cold and fear, as I watched that unearthly light pulse, I began to think that perhaps I should have paid more attention to that story. Gathering the courage to go back inside the house seemed impossible, but staying outside wasn't an option either. The storm was getting worse, and I could swear the shadows in the backyard were starting to move in the same way as the shadows in the kitchen. I made the decision that would change my life. I needed to find out what was in that basement. With legs shaking, I crawled to the basement window. The heavy rain formed a curtain of water in front of me, but I could see that the window had one of those old basement openings, the kind that opened to the outside. My hands were shaking so much that it took me a good few minutes just to be able to unlock the rusty latch. When I finally opened it, the smell that came out almost made me give up. It was a mix of mold, ozone, and something metallic, like old blood. But the worst thing wasn't the smell, it was the sound. That same humming, whispering sound that I had heard inside the house, only much louder and clearer. And now, so close to the source, I could swear I was starting to understand some of the words, even though my brain refused to fully process them. I squeezed through the narrow window and fell awkwardly to the basement floor. The greenish light came from a distant corner, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to make out shapes in the room. There were antique bookshelves lining every wall, packed with books so old they looked like they were about to turn to dust. But what caught my attention most were the symbols. The concrete floor was covered in markings made with something that looked like chalk, forming concentric circles full of symbols that I had never seen before. In the center of these circles was a machine of sorts, or at least that's what it appeared to be, an aged metal structure with several copper coils and what appeared to be fist-sized quartz crystals. That was where the greenish light came from, pulsing in time with that disturbing sound. And then I realized, the light wasn't just pulsing, it was getting brighter, and the buzzing louder. Panic returned with a vengeance when I heard something moving on the stairs leading to the basement. That thing was coming down. The light from the machine grew more intense by the second, and the symbols on the ground began to glow with the same greenish light. On a desperate impulse, I ran to the machine. There was a diary of sorts open next to her, the yellowed pages covered in frantic notes and complex diagrams. On the opened page, I was able to read something about portal and dimensional resonance, and a warning in bold letters. Frequency must be maintained. Do not allow interference. I looked at the machine again and noticed a detail that had gone unnoticed. One of the crystals was slightly out of alignment, as if something or someone had bumped into it. At that moment, I felt that supernatural cold invade the basement. The shadow was there. I didn't need to turn around to know that she was right behind me. I could feel that oppressive presence sucking all the heat and light from the room. The buzzing was now deafening, and the light from the machine was so bright it was almost blinding. In a movement that was pure instinct mixed with desperation, I grabbed the misaligned crystal and pushed it back into place with all my might. The sound that followed was like nothing I had ever heard before. A metallic scream that reverberated throughout the house, causing dust to fall from the ceiling. The light exploded in a flash that made me close my eyes, and when I opened them again, a few seconds later, I was alone in the basement. The machine had stopped pulsing, emitting only a faint, constant glow. The silence was absolute. Even the storm outside seemed to have stopped. I spent the whole night in the basement, afraid to go up. It was only when the first rays of sunlight began to shine through the little window that I found the courage to explore the house. Everything was exactly as it had been before that night. The magnets on the refrigerator, the hallway table I had knocked over were in place. Even the glass of water and Nature Valley I had dropped were missing. If it weren't for the mud in the backyard on my Red Sox pajamas and the journal I found in the basement, I might have convinced myself it was just a bad dream. I spent the next few days devouring that diary, trying to understand what had happened. It belonged to the previous owner of the house, a physicist called Edgar Morrison, who had apparently developed a theory about parallel dimensions in the 1920s. According to his notes, he managed to create a machine that opened small gaps between the dimensions, but something went wrong in one of his experiments. In the last diary entry, dated 1923, he wrote about an entity that began to appear after the machine was first activated. Morrison believed he had inadvertently created a kind of dimensional prison. The machine kept the entity trapped between dimensions, preventing it from fully entering our world, but also preventing it from returning to wherever it came from. The misaligned crystal must have weakened this prison somehow. I ended up discovering that I wasn't the first to see that thing. Researching the local archives, I found several reports from former residents about shadows and presences in the house, but no one had previously found the diary or understood what was going on. I sold the house 3 months later, but before that, I built a false wall in front of the basement entrance and left detailed instructions hidden away for the next resident who needed them. The machine is still down there, working, keeping whatever it is trapped between the dimensions. Sometimes, especially on stormy nights, I still dream about those eyes watching me from all the windows at the same time, and I wake up feeling that supernatural cold. But at least now I know I'm not crazy, and that there are things in the universe that science still can't explain. It was a Thursday night like any other in July. I've been living alone for about 3 years in an old house in the Jardim Paulista neighborhood in Sao Paulo. I have always been a very systematic and security-conscious person, the result of growing up with an extremely protective mother who taught me from an early age the importance of locking all doors and windows before going to sleep. That particular night, I was particularly tired after a stressful day at work. I'm a project manager at a technology company, and we had just lost an important client, which resulted in an endless series of tense meetings with management. I got home around 11 p.m., completely exhausted, just wanting to take a hot shower and go to bed. As I always did before bed, I followed my usual checking routine. I locked the front door, double-checking as usual. I went through the kitchen door that leads to the back and turned the key in the lock, pulling the handle a few times to make sure it was really locked. I closed all the windows, including the one in my room on the second floor, which I used to leave ajar on hot nights. I still took that last look through the living room window, observing the deserted and silent street, lit only by the yellowish streetlights that cast strange shadows on the asphalt. I clearly remember doing all of this because it was practically a ritual for me. Something as automatic as brushing my teeth or setting the alarm clock. After this thorough check, I finally went up to my room, got under the covers and fell asleep almost instantly. It was around 3:40 in the morning when I woke up scared, for no apparent reason. You know that strange feeling that something is wrong, even though you don't know exactly what? That's exactly how I felt. I lay in bed for a few minutes, motionless, trying to understand what had woken me up. The early morning silence was almost deafening, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock I inherited from my grandmother and the soft purring of my cat, Galileo, who slept peacefully at the foot of the bed. There were no unusual noises, no sounds of footsteps or voices. In fact, the house was too quiet, in a way that made me uneasy. It was then that I noticed a cold draft that shouldn't have been there since all the windows were closed. Reluctant to get out of bed, I spent a few more minutes trying to convince myself that it was just paranoia, that nothing was wrong. But that cold breeze continued to bother me, and Galileo, who usually slept through the night, began to stir strangely. He sat up, his ears pricked up and his eyes fixed on the bedroom door, as if he was paying attention to something I couldn't perceive. It was at that moment that I decided to get up to investigate. I grabbed my cell phone to use the flashlight. I didn't want to turn on the lights in the house and confirm my suspicions that something was wrong. I tiptoed down the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible, my heart beating so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I approached the kitchen with hesitant steps, guided only by the dim light of my cell phone. The antique wooden floors creaked beneath my bare feet, each creak seeming absurdly loud in the early morning silence. It was when I pointed the light toward the back door that my blood ran cold. It was wide open, letting in that cold breeze I had felt up there. But it wasn't a normal opening. The door was wide open at a 90-degree angle, as if someone had deliberately opened it that way. The most disturbing thing is that there was no wind strong enough to justify this. In fact, the night was particularly calm, without any strong breeze that could have forced the lock. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind began to frantically inventory all the logical possibilities. Had I really locked the door? But I clearly remembered checking the lock, as I did every night. Could it be that the lock was defective? Impossible. I had changed all the locks when I moved. As I stood there at the entrance to the kitchen, I began to notice other strange details. The curtains on the window over the sink were swaying gently but unnaturally, as if someone had just walked past them. And there was a different smell in the air, something I couldn't identify but that definitely didn't belong to my house. A mix of wet earth and something metallic. It was then that Galileo, who had come down the stairs behind me without me noticing, began to act in a way I had never seen before. His fur was standing on end, growling softly at something in the dark yard beyond the open door. My cat has always been extremely docile and calm. In 5 years, I had never seen him growl like that. His behavior made my heart race even more. With shaking hands, I pointed my cell phone light at the backyard, but the darkness seemed to swallow the beam of light, as if it were denser than normal. The small garden I maintained with such care felt different, hostile, as if it had transformed into another place overnight. The shadows between the plants seemed to move strangely, even without wind. Gathering all the courage I could, I took 2 steps towards the door, deciding to close it and run back to the room. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach sink. There were mud marks on the kitchen floor, forming an uneven path leading from the backyard. They weren't defined footprints, but rather drags and stains, as if someone or something had crawled inside. The scary thing is that the marks were wet and fresh, glistening in the cell phone light, when it hadn't rained in at least a week. At that moment, Galileo let out a high-pitched, anguished meow, running to hide under the kitchen cabinet. The sudden sound almost made me drop my cell phone, and that's when I heard it. A muffled noise coming from upstairs, as if something heavy was moving down the hallway. My first impulse was to run for the front door, but something told me that would be the most predictable and possibly dangerous move. Instead, I slowly crouched down next to the kitchen island, trying to control my increasingly rapid breathing. The noise upstairs continued, now more defined. There were slow, shuffling footsteps, as if whoever or whatever was up there had difficulty moving. The sound was coming directly from the direction of my room, and I could have sworn I heard something being rummaged around, probably my drawers or closet. I couldn't stop thinking that moments before, I had been sleeping peacefully right there, completely vulnerable. Suddenly the silence returned, even more oppressive than before. That sudden pause was even worse than the noises, because now I didn't know where the thing was. My eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to follow any movement through the sounds of the wooden floor. That's when I noticed something disturbing. Small, dark drops began to drip from the kitchen ceiling, falling in a regular rhythm and forming a small puddle next to me. At first I thought it was water from a leak, but the metallic smell I had smelled before became stronger. When I brought the cell phone closer to get better light, my heart almost stopped. The liquid was thick and dark red, with a consistency that I knew well from working for so many years as a volunteer at a veterinary hospital. It was blood, without a doubt. At that exact moment, I heard a dull thud coming from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen, followed by a sound I'll never forget. A kind of hoarse, irregular breathing, amplified by the silence in the house, which seemed to come from everywhere. Directions at the same time. It was a wet, guttural sound, as if whoever was making it had their lungs filled with liquid. My legs were shaking so much that I had to lean on the kitchen island to keep from falling. The worst part is that, along with that horrifying breathing, I started to hear a constant shuffling sound, as if something was moving across the ceiling towards me. The drops of blood began to fall more frequently, and now I could clearly see that they formed a pattern, as if they were following the movement of the thing up there. The adrenaline finally overcame the fear and made me act. Still crouched low, I began to slowly move towards the back door. It was still open, and despite my fear of the dark backyard, it seemed like my only possible escape route. Every step was torture, as the old floor could give me away at any moment. When I was a few meters from the door, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was nails or claws scratching the ceiling, going down the kitchen wall. The sound was so loud and close that I could feel the vibration in the wall next to me. I looked up in time to see long dark marks forming on the wallpaper, running down toward the floor as if something was climbing the wall upside down. The metallic smell was so strong now that it made me gag. Everything went very quickly after that. On a desperate impulse, I ran toward the back door, but tripped over something in the dark, probably one of Galileo's water bowls. I fell hard on the kitchen floor, hitting my knee and dropping my cell phone, which slid under the stove, plunging everything into complete darkness. At the same moment, I heard a thud behind me. Something had just landed on the kitchen floor. The sound of abnormal breathing was now just a few meters away, and alongside it I could hear something moving, something large and heavy that seemed to be crawling towards me. The metallic smell was nauseating, and I could feel hot drops falling on my back as I tried to stand up in the dark. In complete panic, I managed to get to my feet and ran blindly towards the backyard, guided only by the faint light coming from the moon. I hit my shoulder hard against the door frame, but the adrenaline was so much that I barely felt the pain. That's when I heard and felt something scratch through my hair, as if it had tried to grab me. The sound that thing made then was the worst of all. A kind of muffled scream, as if it were trying to speak underwater, a voice that was neither human nor animal. I ran across the yard without looking back. I jumped over the side wall with an agility I didn't even know I had, and I only stopped running when I reached the main avenue, where there were some people at a 24-hour bus stop. I spent the rest of the morning sitting in that spot, shivering with cold and fear, watching my house in the distance. Some people tried to come over to help, probably thinking I had been mugged, but I couldn't speak. My throat was closed with panic. I stayed there until the sun rose, gathering the courage to return. When I finally returned, accompanied by 2 police officers who I managed to convince to carry out an inspection, I omitted the most bizarre part of the story, obviously. We found the house completely normal. The back door was closed and locked. There were no mud marks on the floor, no scratches on the walls, no stains on the ceiling. Even my cell phone was on the kitchen table, not under the stove where it had fallen. The only evidence that something had actually happened was a huge bruise on my shoulder, the size of an adult hand, but with marks that didn't exactly look like fingers. They were more like tentacles or thin branches, forming a strange pattern that no doctor was able to explain later. And Galileo, well, he was never the same. He flatly refuses to go into the kitchen after dark, and sometimes spends hours staring at the ceiling, following something only he can see with his eyes. The police suggested that I had been drinking, or that it had been a particularly vivid dream, but I know what happened. I was never able to sleep properly in that house again. I've installed cameras, changed the locks again, put bars on all the windows, but none of that makes me feel safe. Because I know that thing didn't come in by breaking doors or forcing open windows, it just appeared. And the worst thing is that, sometimes on the quietest nights, I still hear that wet breathing coming from upstairs, and I smell that metallic smell in the air. I moved out of that house a week later. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer, even though I had a 2-year lease. I lost my deposit and 3-month security deposit, but I didn't care. My sanity was worth much more than any money. The strangest thing is that when I went to do the final inspection with the real estate agent, the agent let something slip that chilled my spine. Apparently, the last 3 tenants had also left in a hurry, all at more or less the same time of year. When I questioned her further about this, she quickly deflected the conversation and changed the subject, but I could tell she knew something she didn't want, or couldn't, tell me. Today I live in an apartment on the 10th floor of a busy building, with a 24-hour concierge and cameras in every corner. Galileo is slowly returning to normal, although he still has moments when he is completely paralyzed, staring at some point on the ceiling. I never went back to that street, but I always watch the real estate classifieds online. The house continues to be rented regularly, and sometimes I find myself thinking about trying to contact the new residents to alert them. But what would I say? That there is something supernatural living there? To be careful with the kitchen in the early hours of the morning? No one would believe it, just as I wouldn't believe it if someone had told me before. I just hope that whoever is living there now is luckier than me, or at least makes it out in time.